thank you for coming to tonight's Writer's Block event featuring Griffin Dunne and Emma Roberts. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now careening to the finish line of our 28th season. Our 29th season will be announced soon, so stay tuned, and it's amazing. I want to thank Griffin for making Writer's Block his LA stop. Joan Didion was my first Writer's Block event 28 years ago. Thank you. And she returned to Writer's Block several times over the years, as did her husband, John Gregory Dunne, whose essays and novels I adored. All this to say, I'm so deeply grateful to host Griffin for his new and staggeringly terrific book, The Friday Afternoon Club. While he elegantly thwacks his messed up gene pool, he's obviously inherited the right ones from this literary nobility that are the Didion Dunnes. Griffin's family story is filled with unspeakable tragedy, but he imbues it with such dark humor. I gasp and then laugh constantly as he relates his naughty and sort of self-destructive behavior with his rebellious friends. I'd hold my breath and then laugh and gasp some more. His grandparents and great-grandparents were similarly naughty, by the way. I mean, they were scandalous. The stories of his family and their social circles illuminate the political and industrial tycoons of the early 20th century, and of course, entertainment and intellectual aristocracy of the 60s and 70s. It's spellbinding, but it's the stories of his siblings, his parents, his aunt and uncles, and his grandparents that take your breath away. What Griffin has written is introspective, reflective, and magnificent, while revealing the most intimate strands of his family life. Emma Roberts knows a great book when she reads one. She's an actor known for American Horror Story, Scream Queen, and Tell No Lies. Her new venture with Hulu offers her a book-to-film collaboration. She's joined the Superhero Club with Madam Web, and her new series, Space Cadet, will debut on Amazon in July. So, here's what's going to happen tonight. Emma and Griffin will chat. We'll have some time for some audience questions, and I'm going to go around with a mic, so you're going to have to be patient because we need to use the mic for your questions. Here's an important part. No speeches. No speeches. You have to ask questions, and there has to be a question mark at the end, and it has to be no longer than like 2 short sentences with a verb, okay? So, Griffin has signed boatloads of books just now, boatloads. And you should take advantage of these signed books now because Book Soup is the lucky store that landed this gig tonight, and they're the ones with the signed books. Remember, it's Father's Day coming up, people. And so what could possibly make for a better Father's Day gift than the Friday Afternoon Club? So, that said, please welcome Emma Roberts and Griffin Dunne.
Hello, everybody.
I can't see anybody.
I can't see anybody either, but I think that's probably for the best because I'm already shaking because I'm literally sitting next to Griffin Dunne, who I have been always obsessed with as an actor, as a director, as a writer, and I am bragging that I'm holding a galley of his book and not the hard copy. I got it early and read it in literally 5 days, and I laughed, I cried, and I'm so, so honored to be sitting here with our June Bellatrix pick writer, Griffin Dunne, with his new memoir, The Friday Afternoon Club. How are you?
I am amazing. I didn't see this coming. It was just the reception has been so great, and I'm traveling, and when I turned in the book, Penguin said, we're going to go old school. You're going to have a tour. Do you want to go on the road? And I went, yeah. And it's very, very different, than promoting a movie or book. You have company. This is a solo flight, and I did that and started at page 1 and finished it, and now here I am. And
well, I'm so happy we're in person because I've only been talking to people on Zoom all day today, so it's very nice to be in a room full of people and sitting next to you.
Me too.
And what I want to know, I guess, is I feel like you could have written and put out a memoir 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago. Like, the stories in here go back and could have filled up a whole book. So I guess, like, what made you think, you know what, now is the time that I'm really gonna do it, and I'm gonna put this out there, and I'm gonna go on the road for it, and I'm gonna write this family memoir?
Well, you know, I'm from a long line of storytellers on both sides of the family, and I grew up hearing stories, and I tell stories and funny things that happened to me, and, you know, I guess over the past 10 years, I would go, oh, that played pretty well. I'm going to make a note of that and make a note, thinking of a book in the back of my head.
I was going to say, were you like sitting on this manuscript for
no,
for how long?
I was, but I was collecting.
Yeah, collecting.
And writing, you know, more anecdotal sort of prose. And my agent, who's here in the house, David Kuhn, had been after me for years. You've got a book in you. You've got a book. Where is it? Where is it? And then one day, I gave him like 50 pages. And he went out and, you know, put me, we had Zoomed with every publisher around. And at that time, I thought it was going to be more sort of anecdotal, or kind of like Me Talk Pretty, the David Sedaris, you know, chapters of, you know, my family and intertwining them and going through the years. And my editor, John Burnham Schwartz, is a wonderful novelist himself. He said, you know, write it, that's all good, but write it chronologically, see what happens. And then I had to go to the Mexican Revolution with Pancho Villa, drove my mother's side of the family to Nogales, Arizona, and the Great Famine, and then my parents' childhood, and I just sort of saw my parents as little kids, and my mother was a lonely only child on a cattle ranch, and my father was, you know, abused by his father in Connecticut, in Hartford, and I just couldn't stop writing. So I don't remember the original question.
No, yeah, sorry, can I tell
I
you?
Can't stop talking either.
Please don't. You made me want to have to like go through a family tree, and that's something that your aunt Joan Didion, who I just absolutely love, and my book club would literally not exist without my love for her stories and her stories. But she always would dive into like her heritage and was very into talking about how, you know, she came from people that were in the Donner Party, and I was always so fascinated by that. And you know, your grandparents, the way you talk about them, it made me want to like dive into my family tree, and my family tree stopped so abruptly, and I know nothing, and I could not fill a book this big. But it makes me wonder, like, do you see your parents differently when you get to the end of this book? And is that like an emotional thing to kind of see your parents as people, I guess?
Well, yeah, it's been, everything about this has been emotional. You know, it was like writing the book was really like living with them, and I wasn't really ready to start, I guess, until I had the distance of their not being alive anymore, and that I could really see them clearly. And you know, when I did a documentary about Joan, and that sort of started to go, oh,
obsessed with.
What?
Loved, obsessed with, okay. Loved.
Well, that also started the wheels turning, and I knew where they were going to end up. I knew that my father was, you know, going to be the fearless guy he was, and the writer and the fighter for victims' rights, and my mother, how, you know, which she survived, not just, you know, not just the loss of her daughter, but other other daughters. And so I knew that I could go into, you know, their flaws and their, you know, contradictions and the weaknesses, and because I knew I was going to get to their strengths. But
still with love, and that's something that I love. That when I love book dedications. Like, I'm obsessed with them, especially with older books, and I feel like they go overlooked in new books. And you dedicated this book to your brother Alex, and you had said that when you kind of asked his permission, he had really just said, you know, write with love. And I feel like you've done something that I imagine is hard for someone writing a memoir, which is dig into flaws, but yet I don't think anyone came out looking bad. And I really loved that about this. Like, I think you did write with love, but you also wrote with darkness and humor and the reality of who these people are as people outside of being your family. And I feel like that is really hard to do without making everybody look horrible.
It was the greatest note I could have gotten when he told me, just, but write whatever you want about me. Just have it from a place of love. And I went, oh, I know how to do this.
Did he know you were dedicating the book to him, or was that a surprise when he got the book?
That was a surprise.
Was he touched?
He was very touched. He was one of the first readers.
That's what I was going to ask.
and there were so many times I was tempted to just send him pages along the way. He's a extremely intelligent guy, just beyond. Even as a little boy, he was like reading adult books and turning the pages with little fingers, and he was so curious about everything. I would call him an open-faced sandwich of feelings. And he, I would think, God, I don't want to feel that much.
I think you said, I'm misquoting you, but in the book you said that you guys would joke that an absinthe-drinking poetess left him on your doorstep.
Yes, he was.
Is what you thought? Because he was just too special and felt too much.
Yeah, my sister and I would go, are we sure he's with us? He's such a unique, passionate and loving person. And I always knew that I wasn't sure what the title would be, but I always knew the subtitle from the beginning was a family memoir. And so I said, Alex, I want to write this book, and it's about our family. And, some 20 years ago, he was struggling with mental issues. And he's fine now. He's great. He's married, one of the longest running marriages in the Dunne family. But he was very proud of it when he read the book. He would tell everyone.
Good.
And he said, "Boy, that was a little tough reading that section about me, but yeah, you got it right."
I almost want someone in my family to write a book so I can just learn more about my family, but then I'd also be scared too. One of the things that you said that I loved is that this is like one of my favorite lines in the book is where you say, if you grow up with novelists, someday you will be collateral damage for a good story. And I thought that was, obviously so sickly fabulous. But I was wondering, was there ever a time that you want to share where you felt like I was collateral damage for this story?
Well, and my aunt also famously wrote, "A writer is always selling somebody out."
Yes, always.
And yes, I was once. This is kind of embarrassing, but I wrote it in the book, so what the hell? But when I hit puberty, I realized there was an ownerism thing going on, and I was just, I made a list, and I put when I went to New York, go to the Different Drummer, buy Bell Bottoms, buy the new Jimi Hendrix album, Beat Off, go to this thing, and I listed go to the Cornet Theater, Beat Off, and my father came home, and he was producing Boys in the Band, and I guess he had a tough day on the set. And the apartment, I had my clothes and all that stuff over it, and he was, pick up your shit, this and that shit. And he was very angry and just grouchy. He had a bad day. And he goes in the bathroom, and he comes out with this list. He goes, "What the fuck is wrong with you? You have to..." And he seemed kind of angry. And then I'm reading John Gregory Dunne's book, my uncle, Dutch Shea, and he has a section, he says, this kid was so stupid, he had to remind himself to beat off. And I call up John, I go, where did you get that? And he went, well, the night after he saw you, we all met up at Elaine's, and he told us this story, and we were crying with laughter. I said, you mean he thought it was funny? He thought it was hilarious. So, a writer is always selling somebody out.
Even if you're a kid with a to-do list, I guess. Mm-hmm. Oh my God! Well, I absolutely love that story, and I was saying this to you when we were chatting back there. I've read Joan Didion my whole life, and I just recently started reading her husband, John Gregory Dunne's work. And it was like seeing the other side of a puzzle where I was seeing this whole other perspective. And I feel like, part of Joan's superpower was she kind of would be vague sometimes. And John was like so kind of brass and like to the point. And I just absolutely loved reading his book Monster most recently. Yeah. And then reading this just filled in so many more blanks for me. And so I guess I'm wondering, were you someone that grew up reading their work and kind of knowing who they were and kind of understanding that? Or were you just like, oh, they're telling stories at the dinner table and writing shit about me that I'm hearing from friends?
No, from the moment I met him, and I was quite young, I was enamored. I was particularly enamored with Joan. I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I met her when I was 5 years old, or no, maybe a little older, but we were about the same height. I thought, that's the kind of girl I would like to be with someday. But, and as I got older, I was very aware that we had a famous person in the family, my aunt. I think it was a billboard on the Sunset Strip for Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which, I had I was dyslexic. I was one of the earliest diagnosed kids to get it, or to be told I had it. And reading was always a chore for me. You're always meant to feel quite stupid, and I was held back a year, and books sort of scared me. So Joan was way out of my league to understand to read. But for some reason, John wrote the way he talked, and he was really funny. And, he wrote a book called Vegas that is it was an inspiration to me because he was like, he was so honest about himself. He laid it on himself as hard as he did about everybody else. And so I even wanted to be, before I wanted to be an actor, I wanted to be a journalist like them. And, they came up with Gay Talese and Hunter Thompson and, of these writers who put themselves also in the story, but also wrote with real honesty.
Totally.
So Joan, I was able to absorb. Once I got kicked out of school, I realized I can read.
It's kind of how it happens, I feel like.
No, it's
I
true.
Never felt smarter than when I left school.
Absolutely. No, then I became a voracious reader.
Totally.
But I didn't have the pressure of SATs and grades and quite honestly just being thought of as not terribly intelligent. And, then I just absorbed all of Joan.
I mean, I was homeschooled, so that was when I started to feel smart when nobody else was in the class with me.
You didn't have any competition?
I had no company or competition, and I could just read in my pajamas all day, and I was like, oh, this whole school thing's not that bad.
Yeah,
I don't know why I was so upset all the time. I guess, so, obviously one of Joan's arguably most famous quotes, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Was that quote always like did that become what it is now more recently, or was that always kind of thrumming in the background? Were people talking about that? Was that something that you heard and kind of, I feel like it started to shadow over her work, and now it's on t-shirts and mugs and magnets and everything. And so I'm just wondering, do you remember that being a famous quote?
No, something I think the documentary had a lot to do with that.
Very much so.
And it just has that passage, and the falconer can't hear the falcon, and I just all of the when the doc came out, an entirely new generation of readers. That's what's so wonderful about your book club, that you're bringing me to this, that I'm going to get some younger readers as well. But
all of them.
Yes.
And, I'm also buying this as a gift all year long for everyone's birthday. So now they know what they're going to get. Christmas too.
But that was that is just a sentence that just lands with you.
Yeah.
But it was not anything we heard growing up.
And the doc itself, I mean, it's called "The Center Will Not Hold," which is also such a beautiful sentence. And I want to know, like, whose idea was the doc? Was that you, Joan? Was it the family? And also, like, what was that experience like making the doc with her? And I'm sure, obviously, very special. But was it also, you know, working with family?
Yeah.
They say.
In typical Joan fashion, she asked her her publisher, Sonny Mehta, to call me to ask if I would do a video of Blue Nights, which was her last book that followed Year of Magical Thinking, and Year of Magical Thinking about the loss of John, of course. But Blue Nights is a blisteringly painful book, where Joan is terribly tough on herself, very difficult to read, called Blue Nights. And so we did one of those videos for a promotional tool, and we had a very young crew, and they couldn't believe they were riding in a van with Joan Didion, and we go from the Botanical Garden up to St. John's Cathedral, and she had a ball, and she just she wanted to be an actress originally, you know. And so she just was like, and she was hitting all her marks. She was fantastic. And I said, you know, I wanted to push my luck. And so many people have...
You?
Yeah, me. And so many people have asked to do a documentary. And I realized I was the only one she would let. And it was almost like a calling. It was like, this isn't going to...
It felt like it when I mean, I was in a hypnosis watching it. Several times.
Yeah, and I wanted people to see Joan the way I grew up with Joan. You know, people had an impression of a dark, dour woman who thought about snakes and suicide and the end of the world, apocalyptic things. And you know, I wanted them to hear the trill in her laugh. Yeah. And
well, I like that you chose on the cover a beautiful family photo, but specifically Joan is smiling. And I don't think I ever had seen Joan smile before I saw the cover of your book. How long did you guys shoot that for? Like, how long did you work on that?
We could not get a distributor or a financer.
That's crazy.
So I paid out of my own pocket to get all those interviews. And then we put together a sizzle reel, and with the sizzle reel, which went viral, every single place that turned us down came roaring back. Yeah. Go figure. So I think it was, under 2 years, though, eventually.
That's amazing. And so I have to ask, are we turning this into a movie or a show? I know it's like, let's just let people read the book first, but of course, like, my brain goes to the place of a movie or a show. And I'm just curious, since, you're a writer, a director, an actor, a producer, a financier sometimes, like, is something in the works?
One of the most fun parts for me to write about in this book was my teen years in LA, my driver's license, how a LA kid exists and gets around through Los Angeles without a car, and the trouble and the adventures that they get into. And so
this was before Uber.
What?
Before.
Yeah. and there was one. I'm interested in like a kind of a Wonder Years sort of licorice pizza kind of feel of LA.
Yes, Wonder Years, love.
But one night, my friend Charlie Wessler, who I grew up with, a childhood friend, and still best friend, we were determined to drive, and we would always sneak out of the house, and we would go up and down the block and look for cars that had keys in them, and. We finally
I think that's
found
called
one.
theft.
It's called auto theft, yes. And then we chickened out, and we decided, let's just steal my mom's car. And we get in the car. It's like 2 in the morning. We get phone books, so we could see over the steering wheel. And we're driving, and we go up Benedict Canyon. And as we're coming up Benedict Canyon, the canyon itself is just cherry tops from cops and helicopters, and it's all lit up, and we see just a cops looking toward us. And Charlie says, "Your mom must want this car back really bad." And we're driving past, and the cop with the clipboard just looks at these two midgets, and he just goes, "Just go, go." And then we drive by, and then we see the crime tape. And we passed the house on Cielo, and we didn't know. So, you know, I mean, I kind of, you know, my life when I was writing it, as a kid, I almost like felt it was like Zelig-like. I was always, you know, in touch, you know, with these cultural moments, you know, or being in, after the divorce, being on the island of Coronado during the Vietnam War, and my mother dating briefly Daniel Ellsberg and the FBI coming to tap our phones. Which Charlie and I would pick up the phone, we'd hear the click, and we go, "Who do you think your wife is fucking right now? You're listening to two teenage kids talking on the phone. What kind of life do you live?"
So you're saying you lived through some of the most historical moments.
I was right at the center of it.
The last 100 years, and that your life lends itself to a very cinematic sensibility, if you will.
That's what I want.
And you come from a family of very, very smart and successful writers. Okay, fine. Fine. I guess that's okay. I mean, that is crazy. When did you put that together? Like, is this with the Cielo Drive story? I mean, was that like the next day, or was that?
No. The bodies were found that morning. It was in all the papers.
No, when did you hear? Like, or realize?
We just weren't thinking of it.
God.
We wasn't. Our priority was to drive a car.
See, isn't that so crazy?
Yeah. And you know, and Joan has written this as well with my mom. You know, she was in the pool.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
They were in the pool when
that.
the word, you know, when it came out over the radio. That was like, and then you know, I would hitchhike from the time I was, you know, 12 and get in the car with total strangers, and it was, the parents of my generation I was raised with, you know, I call benign neglect. You know, they were very loving.
I haven't heard of that.
couldn't be less curious how we spent our time. As long as we were alive at dinner. You know, they had their own problems.
See, I have, I say this with great respect, but I have the nosiest mother of all time, where I told her recently that I think her real calling would have been a warden at a mental hospital, because she does room checks on us.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, I'm 33, you don't have to come in here. But, you know, she does, turns on the light, checks that we're still there. I'm like, we're here. But benign neglect, that's good to know. That's very good to know.
Yeah, and I actually appreciate that.
I appreciate that too. Wow, okay. I have a lot to ruminate on here. Do you want to read anything out of your book?
Yes.
Or
sure.
I believe there was something you wanted to read. And then maybe if there's time, I'll read a little short quote of one of the many underlines I've done of my favorite quote in here.
Please do.
But I would love you to read to the people that haven't picked up a copy yet, just to hear your very original voice.
By the way, it's much harder to read yourself than it is somebody else. I don't know what that's about. But this is apt, as we've been talking about both my father and Joan. This is, well, you'll see. My Uncle John brought his fiancée to meet my parents in the spring of 1963. John met Joan Didion in New York when he was working at Time magazine and she was at Vogue. When Joan's love for Manhattan had run its course, achingly described in her essay, Goodbye to All That, John suggested they quit their jobs and move to Los Angeles. She needed no convincing. He introduced her to my mother over the phone with hopes she might look at a house they'd found for rent in the want ads. The two women had only the tone in their voices to go on, but each recognized that the person at the other end of the line would be a significant part of their lives. Joan felt more at ease with the daughter of a rancher than with the Irish Catholics on John's side, most of whom she felt disappointed in her. Mom was only too happy to look at a house for them, which was all the way in Palos Verdes, an hour's drive from Beverly Hills. When she called Joan back with a positive review, John read it sight unseen. My parents invited John and Joan to lunch soon after they settled in Palos Verdes. Now that Mom was to meet her future sister-in-law in person, she was surprisingly nervous, puffing away on low-tar cigarettes and fussing over the table setting she'd arranged by the pool. My mother was a voracious reader, had followed Joan's articles in Vogue, and had consumed Run River, her debut novel, in one sitting. Joan was a serious writer, Dad explained to his children, not like the hacks he'd hired to write at Four Star, his television studio. A novelist living in Los Angeles was then a novelty, and my parents showed more attention to the details of this lunch than they ever had entertaining Hedda Hopper or an out-of-town Viscount. Dad made Alex and me change our outfits several times before deciding we'd look most impressive in matching red swim trunks, each with a gold buckle. When John and his fiancée arrived, I was at the pool, and Dad ordered me out as if he'd seen a shark. Mom and Joan hugged on sight, relieved their first impressions of each other, formed over the phone, would prove correct. Dominick and I fell into position according to size, like we were the Trapp family about to meet our new nanny. Dominick curtsied before Joan, who giggled, thinking it was a joke, which it was not. Dad always made Alex and me bow when meeting adults, but our wet swim trunks took the pomp out of that circumstance, so we just solemnly shook her hand. "How do you do?" I said, as we'd been trained. Joan looked at me through sunglasses and smiled warmly. I was struck by how she was not much taller than me and just as skinny. I was too young to have a girlfriend, but I remember thinking, should I ever go steady, I'd want to be with someone who looked just like Joan. Griffin, said John, I think you got a little something sticking out down there. From the broken seam of my trunks, a lone testicle had parted from its twin, poking out like a lonely grape. Dad and John's laughter roared in my ears, and my face flushed hot with shame. The only way to rein in my embarrassment was to remain focused on Joan, the only person not finding me hilarious. She looked more embarrassed for the cackling Dunnes, telepathically conveying to me, I'm not with those guys. Within the decade, Joan would be famous for taking positions contrary to popular opinion, accepting the vitriol that followed, and not straying from an inner strength she called character. The house my mother found them was on a bluff called Portuguese Bend that overlooked the Pacific. Not long after our lunch by the pool, I saw the movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World at the Cinerama Dome. To this day, I have never laughed so uncontrollably in a movie theater. It opens with Jimmy Durante slowly dying from a car accident, telling the 5 motorists who stopped to help him that he buried 3,350 G's under the big W. The what? The motorist asked, hoping to get more information. Under the big W, he says, and in his last gasp of breath. He then kicks the bucket. I mean, an actual bucket that happened to be at his feet, sending it down the canyon and me into a fit of hysterics. The 5 motorists then embark on a mad, mad road trip to find the money buried under the W. For weeks, I would annoy anyone in earshot with my impression of Durante by croaking, under the big W. The first time I went to John and Joan's house, I nearly kicked the bucket when I saw in their backyard 4 slanted palm trees in the shape of a W. The same W where Jimmy Durante told the 5 lunatics he buried the cash. Look, it's the big W, I tell you. I screamed in my best Jonathan Winters. It's a big W. What are you going on about? Asked John. Those are the palm trees from the movie. It's a mad, 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 mad world. Yeah, I heard they shot some movie before we arrived. Some movie. Some movie. Only the funniest movie on the face of the earth. All right, calm down, said John, far more amused than annoyed. My passion for movies tickled him, and we often compared notes on what we'd last seen. A Shot in the Dark, hilarious, I once told him. The Pink Panther, I hear it's a piece of shit. You heard wrong. I saw Goldfinger last week. Amazing. Did you know that the girl they painted gold died? I'm more of a Dr. No Man. You're crazy. This Bond is much better. You know, Sean Connery saved my life. You brought that up more than once. You're a worse name dropper than your father. We established early on a sort of Irish rat pack shtick, where ribbing and gossip was our currency. The delight we took in each other's company would in time torment my father. But in those early years, Dad was proud to see his smart-ass son keep pace with his little brother. In the mid-'60s, my parents were well immersed in the social frenzy of Hollywood, and for a time were the it couple, invited to every party and hosting their own, big and small, about twice a week. Dad compared himself and Lenny with Gerald and Sarah Murphy, socialites who entertained the great artists of the lost generation on the French Riviera, on whom Fitzgerald based Nicole and Dick Diver in Tender as the Night. Their parties were lively affairs with up-and-coming stars like Warren Beatty and Dennis Hopper, and old dependables like Joseph Cotton and David Niven. Dad always made sure to invite John and his serious writer wife, proud to introduce them around. John was then known as Nick's brother, though by the end of the 60s, Dad would be known as Joan Didion's brother-in-law. John's ambition as a journalist was as cunning as my father's for social climbing. His first book was called Delano, which followed Cesar Chavez through the Central Valley of California, organizing exploited grape pickers to strike. The only time I ever saw John cross with my mother was when she set out a bowl of grapes from Safeway that had been picked by scabs. Delano was serious reportage and well received, but sold few copies. The subject that fascinated him next was the social life of Hollywood. Was not the social life of Hollywood, like his brother, but the business of Hollywood. He wanted to write about people who decided what movies got made, and someday write movies for them as well. At one of Dad's parties, John met Richard Zanuck, president of 20th Century Fox. John earned the studio's head to write the first behind-the-scenes account of what goes on in a dream factory. He hung out on the set of the disastrous Dr. Dolittle, sat in on meetings for future disasters, and pinpointed in brutal detail a time when studio executives had no idea what their young audience wanted to see. The result was The Studio, a scathing and hilarious takedown of 20th Century Fox in 1968, their worst financial year. Zanuck not only didn't take offense at the book, but gave John his first screenwriting assignment. John would later write several more screenplays for Zanuck, who by then no longer took my father's calls.
I mean, it's so good. It's so good. I do think it's really interesting that you touch on that kind of everybody in your family kind of went from like being known as one thing to another, and everyone kind of would eclipse each other at different times. Yeah. And I just find that so interesting, and a family dynamic of, you kind of have said this a couple times where it's like, are they with us or I'm not with them? And I feel like that was like ever shifting through your family, as it does, I think, through most families.
Indeed.
And I guess, you know, because you talk about in your book how, you know, your mother and father had a bit of a distance falling out with Joan and John, but you still kind of meandered across both. I mean, like, how did you kind of manage that? And did you realize that, like, while it was happening, or was it more on reflecting in the book the kind of I'm not with them, they're not with us kind of thing.
No, their tension was right out front. You know, and it was very painful to see because I loved them both. And it was really between my father and his brother. And, you know, my father was beaten as a child among the 5 siblings in the house. John was much younger. He had no relationship like that with the father. He had a very loving relationship with his father. And, but the 2 men were very, very close. But, you know, when they come to Hollywood, you know, Dad really, you know, he had a tremendous descent and from drinking and all sorts of problems, self-made problems, that, as he would be the first to admit. But when he was sort of, you know, giving these, you know, glorious parties, and every movie star of, you know, from the 40s and 50s were coming to their house, and the studio heads were there. You know, he was John. That was his entree, and the way Hollywood can be. And suddenly, Dad's career had imploded, and he'd lost all of his money and sold all of his belongings in a yard sale. And the very people who, you know, were kicking him when he was down were now haggling with him over endirons and ashtrays. And
that's insane.
And this is when John and Joan entered the 70s, in a totally different era. And you know, the people that went to their parties, and, you know, Joseph Cotten, and, you know, and even Billy Wilder and William Wellman and George Stevens, you know, they weren't able to make movies like they could. You know, so John and Joan became, you know, sort of the Murphys from the Fitzgerald book, and entertained all, you know, every incredible filmmaker you can imagine out of that period at their house in Malibu. And so there's that sort of changing of the guard that's very, very painful, especially when you're down.
Well, but then I mean, your father then did become...
What happened was
what he became, which
is how you had to go way down, and some people never come back up, but he dug deep. He got sober. He drove up the coast of California till his car broke down in a town called Sisters, Oregon, and he lived in a cabin for a year without a phone.
Wow. And
he wrote. What he wanted to be was a writer, and he would send Alex, Dominick, and I single-page, long, typed, single-spaced letters, and you could see him. This was his workshop. This is how he was finding his voice as a writer, and relations still were strained, but, you know, I was Switzerland, and I was always trying to bring them together, and it always blew up in my face. And one day, they still weren't speaking. You know, John had heart problems with his ticker, as he called it, and he was in his cardiologist's office, and my father he was having minor issues, but he had to see a cardiologist. And he walks into the office, and they have the same cardiologist. And they pretend, they kind of nod, they pick up magazines that they pretend to read. And then John or my father, I never was clear, he looks up and goes, "What the fuck are we doing?" And they just laughed. And they were on the phone every day till the end of John's life. And, you know, Dad always said, thank God we got back. And they were, you know, my memory as a kid was seeing them on the tennis court, and they were so close when I was a kid. And I was just so happy for my dad that he was able to do that, and I'd hear that laughter all over again, you know.
I love that.
So I knew how that story was going to end.
That's beautiful. I mean, it is interesting. I feel like we're all, like, my sister's 10 years younger than me, and I'm like, you don't even know, like, the mom that I had. Like, it's always different. And then I see my mom with my son, and I'm like, what? He's allowed to do this? Like, I would, what? And so it's just interesting how we all are different people to our family at different phases of our lives, and, like, hopefully we can be, you know, proud of most of it. And I think you've done a really beautiful job with, like, weaving the patchwork of your family stories, and how dark some of it has been, how hard some of it has been, but also like you guys feel like family, and I really do feel like you wrote a family memoir, and I'm so grateful that you got to share it with me and with us. And I'm just so happy to be here and chatting with you, and thank you guys all for being here.
Thank you.
I think there's some questions. If anyone wants to ask a couple of questions, I don't know. I'm not in charge of that, but I can be. If you would like. Are we doing questions? Oh, there you are. Sorry, I can't see anything. Is this what it's like to be a pop star, where you can't see anything? Do you want you want this one? Of course. There you
go. Okay. Right over here, short question.
Thank you, Griffin and Emma. Griffin, did your family ever talk about Panic in Needle Park? There was actually a showing of it at the Cinematheque 2 weeks ago with Al Pacino and Jerry Schatzberg. And
yeah, if you study very closly, you'll see Al Pacino in the bodega, and that little boy is walking past him. That's my brother. I remember I went to boarding school in Massachusetts from the time I was 11, and that movie was shooting, and I would go to the set, and at Needle Park, it's so hard for people to imagine, was on 72nd, between the meridian of grass between 72nd and 79th Street, and it was just rampant with junkies, and they would all just be there, and you'd see them shooting up, and the Upper West Side was actually very dangerous in the 60s. So yes, and then it's one of the movies at that time. My brother, John and Joan and Dad had an amazing time. They got along so great. They just laughed, and it was so productive. And hiring Jerry Schatzberg, Adam Hollander, the cinematographer, and it's become a template for so many other cinematographers and so many other directors of their vision of New York, and that grainy quality. It's a movie that is timeless.
Hi, Griffin and Emma. Like you talked a little bit earlier about the wonder years and the magic of the 70s, 60s. Do you have any places in LA that you still deeply resonate with that have that magic still? Yeah,
well, certainly the Chateau Marmont, which we would go to as kids. The photographer of the book, Camilla McGrath, lived with this guy, Earl McGrath, and this is on Christmas Day. My mother would have a gathering for people who had nowhere to go on Christmas. Asa Maynor is in the audience. She's over there. And we would always go to Earl and Camilla's for lunch. And there was the riots on the Sunset Strip was going on. And we went there, and Earl brought firecrackers and cap guns for us. And we would, when the riots were going on, we would throw firecrackers off the roof and go, fuck the pigs, anything. We were only like 11. So that place, every time I go there, I feel like I grew up, there in that Suite 64, which is with the big terrace. And the hotels, Charlie and I would haunt hotels. We would, we could walk to the Beverly Hilton, and we would dress up and try to meet girls from out of town and give them a tour. And we would go to conventions, like John Deere conventions, and dance with their wives. And that place hasn't changed at all. So it was, so really all the hotels, the Beverly Hills. There was a place called, a coffee shop connected to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel called Milton F. Price, no longer there. And we would sneak out of the house, and that's where we would go in the middle of the night. And the hostess name was Belle, and she was also a madame for the hotel hookers. And ever since I saw Irma la Douce, I've been fascinated by hookers and Shirley MacLaine. And so we would just go there. We were just like, and we would watch in the booze. It was all ratty, It used to be the place where Shirley MacLaine would go, and and Bogey would sober up after a premiere, and it had seen better days. And the crowd was kind of had seen better days. But we were fascinated by the place, and we just drink coffee. And Belle didn't question us for a second. She always gave us a nice table and just let us order bottomless cups of coffee, and none of this, does your mom know where you kids are shit, So, those sort of areas. And I get plushes, the Troubadour, Dan, the usual haunts, but I always remember where things were just as well.
How about somebody over here? Oh, okay, all right. I'm coming over to the other side. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Hi, thank you both so much for being here tonight. After Hours is probably one of my all-time favorite movies ever. And I just wanted to ask you, was that a dream come true to start to act, and were you supported by your family in that crazy career?
Well, I certainly was, and it was an unimaginable dream come true. The script, Amy Robinson, my producing partner, found the script, and she sent it to me and said, "You're not going to believe this script, and you are so perfect for this script." And she played Teresa in Mean Streets, so she knew Martin Scorsese, and we got him the script, and it was. I had to pinch myself. It was like I just couldn't believe, how it just flowed so well, and my parents were so proud of me, and my dad was just starting to talk about he was known as Griffin Dunne's son when that movie came out. This constantly evolving identification, and. Well, unfortunately, but unfortunately, my dad couldn't get anybody on the phone to get me a job at the time. But I would have taken whatever opportunity it came my way. It actually was tepidly received, and especially critically, and. Which came as a huge surprise to us. And the Pauline Kael, a film critic I admired, I thought, I will say I'd made it if she mentions my name in the New Yorker. Well, she did, and she called me a second-rate Dudley Moore. Yeah, I never thought of her quite the same again. But it went to Cannes. I went with it. It was during a time when, Chernobyl had just happened, and Gaddafi was threatening to blow up planes going to Europe, and so no Americans went, except me. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And when I arrived. Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, none of the big stars would go. And so it was on the front page of Le Monde. It said, a picture of me, and it said, "The bravest American." And I'd walk into restaurants. I mean, Gerard Depardieu flew out of his chair and just hugged me. I never met the man in my life. Anyway, they got it. But who else got it is just about everybody else, starting about 10 years ago. And it's, it just grows and grows and grows. It's amazing. And there's not a more anachronistic movie. But it just holds that anxiety and humor, and it's become an adjective, for when shit goes sideways.
Hi there. When you finished this book, this monumental achievement of personal identity, was it cathartic, jubilant, or depressing?
It was sad. It was... I really loved writing this because it was like I conjured them, I had their company every day. And it wasn't like, it wasn't sad. It was fantastic. And, when it was finished, it was kind of, I went through like mourning all over again. I don't have a reason to go to the office, and this is sort of the second, what I'm doing now is sort of the second act of this, which is, talking about them, and, through, you've had, wonderful times, some terrible times, and I'll suddenly be, I don't know, I'll be sort of gripped by, it always surprises me. And, but even when I'm talking about really, really painful period in our lives, which is, when my sister was murdered, and I've been promoting this, and I'm talking about this period, and the disastrous trial that followed, and what gets me through it is not thinking of it as promotion. I'm like honoring her. Still a fucking open nerve here. No, I'm just honoring her memory, and it lets me talk about my parents' work for victims' rights, and that came as a result of domestic abuse, and my mother started a group called Justice for Victims of Homicide here in California. And they changed laws, and that are now carried in 23 other states. She wanted to do something. She had MS. Thank you. We all thought that this trial would, set her back, and, that she wouldn't survive it. Just the opposite. And, she started this group, and with another couple whose child was also murdered, and they went to Washington. She was given an award by George Bush. She's the shyest woman, very entertaining, very funny, but would not be comfortable talking in a group of five. Well, she would wheel herself out in talk shows, and talk about what was important. This was a demarcation point in our lives. And, when my father writes about all these famous trials, he's writing about O.J., he never lets you forget about the Nicole, and never lets you forget about the Browns. And if it's Phil Spector, Lana Clarkson's not a fourth-rate actress. She was someone's daughter, and she was working, and she had dreams. And yeah, so I just made me proud of him. Can we call it?